Welcome to MarsCast, a podcast from Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where our faculty members address all things theological and cultural through a Reformed lens. I'm your host, Jared Luchabor. In today's episode, Dr. Beach continues to examine John Calvin's views on human nature after the fall. Calvin argued, humans are not coerced from the outside, but our wills are enslaved to sin and unable to choose spiritual good apart from God's grace. Though retaining some intellectual capacity in earthly matters, our understanding is blind to divine truth without illumination. Dr. Beach will explain that Calvin rejected the term free will as promoting human pride, though affirming that humans still make real choices flowing from their corrupt inclinations. He saw God's common grace as restraining utter depravity and allowing human society to function, while only regenerating grace can remedy our innate sinful inability. Here's Dr. Beach to explain some more.
As we continue to examine Book 2 of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, last time we looked at Chapter 1. Here we hope to look at Chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is entitled, Man Has Now Been Deprived of Freedom of Choice and Bound Over to Miserable Servitude. This has to do with human corruption, of course, and how Adam's fall and original sin or total depravity has affected human fallenness relative to the faculty of volition or willing. Calvin will also talk about how it's affected the faculty of understanding. And so this gets into the whole question of free will, bondage of the will, and how does Calvin talk about that? Calvin first urges us, before getting directly into this question, to recognize the perils that plague the words, quote, freedom of choice, end quote. And he says there's at least two perils here to be avoided. One, and he's following Augustine here, when man is denied all uprightness, he immediately takes occasion for complacency from that fact. And basically what he's saying, oh, well, okay, I'm depraved, I'm fallen, I can't do anything about it, so I'll be complacent and lazy, and I'll just sit on my hands, so to speak. And the other error, even however, well, he explains rather this way, nothing, however slight, can be credited to man without depriving God of his honor. So the other error is to deny these things and then give the credit to yourself and that you're fully capable. And his point is, okay, the error is that now you're depriving God of his honor, for we don't, in fact, have our own ability to do whatever we want or solve our problems. So we have to avoid this error of complacency and the error of false boasting. And both need remedy, both need to be avoided, and both set us in the wrong path. Calvin basically tells us that in the schools, or in the realm of theology and philosophy and being taught about human freedom, that there are three kinds of freedom distinguished. First, from necessity, freedom in which we're not under compulsion or we're not coerced, freedom from sin, and freedom from misery. And the second and third of these, Calvin is going to argue, well, no, we're not free from sin and we're not free from misery. But he will say we're free from necessity. All humans, as humans, are free from the sort of necessity that puts us under compulsion or coercion from without ourselves. He's not adverse, Calvin's not adverse to asserting that as fallen, we are under the necessity of sin. It characterizes our nature. It's what we want. It's what we desire. It's what we do. And we're not free from sin's misery, the subsequent corruption and fallout of sin. But he is going to argue, even though he's not going to embrace the term free will, and he has his reasons for that, He is going to argue, nonetheless, we are not under a coercive necessity. He tells us that it will be indisputable that free will is not sufficient to enable man to do good works, unless he be helped by grace, indeed by special grace, which only the elect receive through regeneration. So back to this question, given human fallenness, and what does it mean for humans to be free? One thing it means is they're not free to help themselves, not without God's grace intervening. They're not free to do good works pleasing to God, not in themselves. But they are free from external coercion. Calvin asserts that even fallen humans have the sort of freedom of decision, of making choices. This is an area that a lot of Reformed people are confused about, that when someone like Calvin denies free will, well, therefore we don't make choices. He's never denying that we're choice makers. He's going to say our volition and our desires that drive volition are under a bondage, but that we make choices under a bound or fallen, enslaved to sin volition doesn't mean we're not still choosing what we want now out of a broken, befouled nature. So, as he would tell us, it doesn't mean that man has a free choice equally of good and evil, but he acts wickedly by will, but not by compulsion. Again, that outside force or something coercing you. Says Calvin, to label this sort of freedom, the freedom of making choices, even as fallen people with the noble title free will, we're so enslaved to sin and so apt to it, is just unhelpful. Now, in subsequent Reformed theology, there will be Reformed theologians who see the problem from the other direction. If you deny free will, this creates all sorts of problems and misunderstanding. But for Calvin in his day and time, he thought it was a pernicious error to affirm free will because it tended to lend to other kinds of errors, that we can turn to God in ourselves from our own desires and ability, and that in that sense we can contribute to our salvation even from our depravity. So Calvin's going to deny the term free will. No. That we're choice makers, yes, we still our volition is still involved, and we're still then willers out of a fallen nature. So he's basically following Augustine in this area. According to Calvin, the very idea of a free will tends to puff us up so that we overestimate ourselves when we need to underestimate ourselves. And it being puffed up, we're not learning humility, which is the very heart of the Christian faith. We're always better off when we're humble before God, not proud, when we're not trusting ourselves, but rather trusting Him and looking to Him for help and for answers. Now, as he proceeds, he's going to look more carefully at the faculty of intellect and the faculty of will. And under the faculty of intellect, then, and the reason this is important, is when you make a choice, and again, we're still choice makers, you do so for reasons. You do so exercising your faculty of understanding, where you place value on things, you evaluate things. And now Calvin makes a distinction which, in my judgment, is a little bit still caught in the nature-grace schema. But he distinguishes between our ability to exercise understanding in the common things of life, or earthly things that do not pertain to salvation and the way of blessedness with God, that those two things distinguish. So pertaining to earthly things, the understanding is far more intact and reliable, but it's wholly unreliable and not to be followed at all. In fact, it just brings us to idolatry in matters that pertain to salvation and knowing God as our Redeemer and the life he calls us to. Calvin even goes so far as to say by natural instinct, man fosters and preserves human society, and this is rooted in natural law, and it has a universal dimension to it. It's true of all human beings that everywhere you go, there's a kind of communal life, a certain civil, fair dealing and order. Obviously, there's much squabbling and disagreement about conceptions of equity, but still there's conceptions of equity. And though human social life in foreign lands, you don't know the true God at all, though it limps and staggers and stumbles, yet it still is preserved sufficiently that there's this seed of political order implanted in all people, such that in the light of using human understanding and reason, the faculty of reason, life can proceed to some degree. Calvin would apply this also to the arts and sciences, to liberal arts, to manual skills. There's this universal apprehension of reason and understanding, which by nature is implanted in us. We see it in people who are mentally disabled. When we see people who are not altogether healthy in this regard, we understand all the better what right mental skills involve, and that what we might call natural gifts bestowed to believers and unbelievers alike are, despite human depravity, still function to some degree and bring out blessings. They're really excellent gifts of God, and an admirable light of truth is shining forth in them. And here Calvin is not adverse to appealing to a kind of common grace. It would take us too far afield to go in all of these things, but he would say, look, if you look about human life, even among unbelievers, there's great philosophers, ancient jurists, people with high degree of math skills who know how to bring civic order, who have taught us the art of disputation and oratory, of medicine, mathematical sciences, many such things. And these all come from God, even with people who are unregenerate, but are making use of the light of nature, the faculty of understanding, sufficient to bring blessing, all under God's care and providence. So he sums up this discussion of fallen and unsanctified, the unsanctified power of human understanding, by again saying, in the way of earthly things, yes. And this can be ascribed to the general or common grace of God intervening. But pertaining to spiritual things, absolutely no. So with respect to the human understanding and heavenly life and the way of redemption and walking with God in obedience, knowing God, knowing his fatherly favor, knowing how he's framed us and what his rule for life is. Humans, he says, fallen in sin, blind. They're blind, they're ignorant, they're altogether lost regarding these things. Even the greatest geniuses are blinder than moles, he says, in this area. So pertaining to the divine things of heaven above and the way of salvation, we need divine illumination. Human understanding is not going to get us there. It's not going to bring us to the solution. There's nothing to be expected there. Natural law cannot get her done, so to speak, and solve humans' problems this way. Meanwhile, the purpose of natural law, Calvin shows us, which functions, is to render, finally, humans as inexcusable. Yes, there's a certain standard there that manifests itself, but certainly pertaining to divine things, it just renders us nothing but inexcusable. This is Calvin's definition of natural law, by the way. Natural law is that apprehension of the conscience which distinguishes sufficiently between just and unjust, and which deprives men of the excuse of ignorance, while it proves them guilty by their own testimony. So Calvin's not one to try to create a lot of juice out of the lemon of natural law. It ends in just condemning us. But it also shows us, because it's obscured, because it's suppressed in unrighteousness, we need the 10 Commandments written on tablets, specified, which reflect and basically exhibit the truth of the natural law. They're in tandem with one another. The first table, of course, very obscurely. The second table is much more in the grasp of fallen human beings to at least some degree. But the written revelation is necessary because that which is written in our heart is made so obscure, suppressed in unrighteousness, and to no effect. So from there he comes back from the faculty of understanding to the faculty of will, or the power of volition. And yes, this power is fallen, but it's the power by which we make choices. And this power is subject to bondage, it's wounded, it's enslaved, but as such, it still makes choices. It's just the choices it now makes follow the inclination of our fallen nature. He says, look, God acts freely out of the inclinations or the nature of his nature, if I may put it that way. He acts from his nature. And so now with fallen nature, we do the same. A fallen, enslaved nature. But now we make choices from that nature. But he's not going to give this the nomenclature free will, because then we think we're free to act and do whatever we want according to, as if we could actually change our nature freely. And that's exactly what we can't do and why we need remedy. In chapter 3, very quickly, Calvin explores how only damnable things come forth from man's corrupt nature. And here he shows that human depravity needs God's restraining grace. So he spends a bit of time talking about common grace and how God's common grace, or general grace, he uses different terms. Sometimes he'll even call common grace special grace, because it's special in the sense of not being saving grace. Calvin will say that, look, we need this common grace of God to intervene, to restrain what's inwardly in us. We need a restraining grace of God to hold in check our depravity, which, if given free rein, would end in entire brokenness. So, though humans are under the necessity of sin, humans are not under the necessity of compulsion. Coming back to that idea, it's an important thing to understand that we sin out of our nature. We sin out of our desires. We sin out of our own fallenness. We sin and act against God from our own depravity, and we're not begging God to change us unless God works in us so that we desire to be changed. So human depravity this depravity of will requires the divine remedy. And Calvin won't really get to that until Book 3, but that's through the power of the Spirit and the saving grace of God that heals the human will, the human understanding, and the human heart.
Next time, Dr. Beach discusses John Calvin's views on the role of the law and its relationship to the gospel of Jesus Christ. He explains how Calvin saw the law as serving to reveal human sinfulness and inability to achieve righteousness through works, thereby pointing to the need for redemption through Christ alone, by grace alone, through faith alone. If you enjoyed this episode of MarsCast, please consider subscribing and telling others who might be interested. Also, consider leaving a review. Your thoughts are greatly appreciated, and they help us to enhance our content further. Your support allows us to produce engaging content and build a community of lifelong learners and thoughtful practitioners. I'm Jared Luchabar signing off for now. See you in the next episode of MarsCast.